Now, one of the neat ones that we often don't think about, but it shows up a lot, is offender retributivism. This is where someone does something in a community and we are justified in punishing them insofar as the offender gets what they deserve for their actions. And we're wrong if we don't punish them and give them what's owed. So this turns the owing relationship around. It flips it around 180 degrees, where it's not that the offender owes the community or the victim anything. It's that the person, when someone breaks a law, we owe them something. So us, the victims, owe the offender something. That when the offender or the criminal, the offender, the person who did the harm, whatever, that person, when they do something bad to us, that puts us in debt to them. Namely, we need to punish them back. That they, by their very action of harming us, they put us in debt. Namely, it is our moral responsibility to make sure that they are punished for that crime. That we're morally obligated to give them back what they gave us. And if we don't, then we've not given them what we own and what they're owed. And I've written this out in much greater detail than I'm going to go into right here. But just keep in mind that this is a form of retributivism. It shows up in some of the textbook articles associated with this week. The key to it, though, is that if someone, say that someone enters a community and they rape a member of our community, we as a community owe that person back. What? Well, maybe we owe them a rape back. They raped one of us, so we rape them back. That could be the way it plays out. It could play out other ways too. But this is where you truly get your eye for an eye scenario, typically, is that because when someone chooses to do wrong by us, the victim, that what they've done is they are asking us to do that back to them. And if we don't do it, we're the ones in the wrong. That everyone is like an autonomous, rational, moral, willing agent, if we go back to deontology. And so when someone overtly does something that disrespects us, then we're still obligated to respect them. Remember the way that works with deontology. This is a heavy-duty deontology version of punishment theory in most cases, that assume that everybody is an autonomous, willing, rational, moral agent. And then say one of those disrespects us, or they disrespect some member of the community. Well, even though they disrespected us or some member in the community, we as a community are still morally obligated to show respect for them. And the way we do that is by punishing them. We acknowledge their rationality, that person knew what they were doing was wrong, and if we didn't punish them, then we're not giving them their due for being rational enough to know what they did is wrong. When they do something wrong, knowingly do something wrong, the only way we can show respect for them is to punish them. Because when we punish them, it acknowledges that they knew better. And yet they knew the better, they chose the worse. And so we hold them accountable for that. But it's on us to do that. We owe them that. It's not that they owe us anything, we owe them. And we're the immoral ones if we don't do it. Extremely interesting position. I encourage people, read through this real carefully. It's a neat sort of theory of punishment. Another one is denunciation. Punishment's justified insofar as we denounce criminal behavior. Remember that condemnation, communicating disapproval. Yeah, so it's okay to punish insofar as we're doing it in an effort to let someone know loudly and clearly we don't like that behavior. That's one theory of punishment. And then there's hybrids. of all of these things. Like you can have a punishment theorist that picks little pieces from all of these and puts them all together. There's always hybrids. And in some sense, hybrids is the most popular theoretical perspective at the moment. Many people, because as we will see, there's potential weaknesses in all these theories. And so one of the best way to mitigate against weakness is to be a hybrid. Or either you inherit all the weaknesses. It could go either way. Now we reach the objections. And before we look at these, I want to make it extremely clear that none of these objections completely upend any of the theories that we've looked at. That's what all of these things are. These are all theories of why punishment may be morally justified. Each and every one of these. And they're really just different reasons for why it's okay to punish. But there's theorists that have done a whole lot of work about them. I've just, reduced them down to a few sentences. Or, more than a few in some cases, like offender retributivism, for example. But all of these are, theories. They're claims. Like, this is why it's okay to harm someone because they've harmed someone else. This is why it's morally okay to punish. That's what these theories provide, a claim about. Well, there's objections to those theories, though. But none of these objections are definitive. They will just get us started this week. Objections to harm reduction. So the harm reduction theory, remember, it says that punishment is justified insofar as it reduces harm for the community or group or small group, large group. Well, the first objection to harm reduction is what exactly counts as harm? Like I've done in this video, I've kind of just hand-waved at harm. I've said, harm is when we do something to a person or an animal that is contrary to that being's interest. We've made their world and experiences a little less pleasant than it would otherwise be. That's the way I've kind of on the fly defined harm. But we may need to do more than that. We may need to get really clear about what the notion of harm is. We do need to be extremely clear about what counts as harm in particular cases in order for harm reduction theory to make any sense at all. Is that it's not okay to say, it's okay to punish because it reduces harm across our community. Well, the idea is, but what do we mean by harm? How do we know that it's been reduced if we don't know what harm is in particular cases? So there's got to be a lot of work done. Any harm reduction theorist has to be very specific and very careful about what is meant by harm in the context of the theory. And does it count like, one way to get really specific about this is to say, is harm only a physical thing? Or is it a psychological thing? Or is it a little of both? Like, am I harmed by being stabbed with a knife? Or am I harmed when my feelings are hurt because someone threatens to stab me with a knife? Like, do hurt feelings count as harm? Like say that I hurt someone's feelings. I say something that hurts their feelings. Well, it says hurt feelings. Hurt is, harm, just by a different word. It's like, it's typically past tense, this person was hurt. Whereas we say, I am going to harm them, and then after I've done that, I have hurt them. So, you could kind of chop it up with harm could be what I am going to do, and then after I've done it, hurt is what is what happens, what's the case now. But either way, is hurt feelings really a case of harm? We need to be clear about that. And that is an objection or a potential huge problem for harm reduction theorists. If we are not very specific about what counts as a harm and what doesn't, then we can't be sure whether any of it was reduced or increased. The next one is deterrence. And this is one that's extremely interesting in an everyday sense. That one of the big justifications for a lot of contemporary legal systems, criminal justice systems, prisons, jails, is this notion that by punishing people, we deter others from doing those bad deeds. And moreover, we deter the people who did the bad deed from doing it again. Like, we punish in order to make it so distasteful that no one wants to do it again. They don't want to be punished for it again. And other people see us punished for it, and they're like, "Ooh, I don't want that punishment, so I won't do that crime." Then that's the notion of deterrence. Well, the objections to deterrence are extremely just concrete, empirical, and practical. According to this 2018 report by the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics, they did a study of people who were released from prison across 30 states. They did random sampling. It looks like they did fairly decent, statistical analysis. This study is in the voluntary module for this week, so everyone can check it out for themselves. But this is just a quote out of it, is that they did a study where they followed people from 30 different states, and quite a bit, 1,500, 1,000, 2,000 released prisoners across 30 states over the course of 9 years. What they found was that during the course of that 9 years, 83%, that's 5 out of 6, of the people who were released from prison were rearrested for some other crime, and they may not have ended back up in prison. They may just have ended up in jail, or they may have ended up back in prison. Those details are in the study, but the reality is that 83% of these people released did something wrong later down the line within a 9-year span of having been released. What's up with that? That's what's known as recidivism. It's where a person is released from jail, or they're released from prison, or they may never have gone to jail or prison. They were just put on probation, and they are found guilty of a crime. They're punished for that crime, and yet later down the line, in some span of time, say 10 years later, they do the same crime again or other crimes. That the punishment for whatever it was does not seem to have had a deterrent effect for crime in general, at least. That's extremely concerning for someone that wants to argue that punishment is justified insofar as it deters people from doing those things, when you have 83% of the people who were punished, and yet they went and did bad things on them. They continued to not be deterred from doing these communally unacceptable behaviors. Now, they may have been rearrested for something that not their original crime. Like they could have been in prison for, say, Grand Theft Auto. But then they're released, and then they may be arrested later down the line for some drug offense or whatever. But either way you go, that they were punished for something, and yet that did not deter them from doing other bad things, or other things that are considered to be crimes. And in some cases, people went back and did exactly the same thing. They were imprisoned for drug offenses. They're released, then they're rearrested for drug offenses not 3 years later. That would be an indication that whatever the punishments are in these 30 states in the U.S., and it could be, all kinds of, this could be a message across all prison and punishment systems, that do those things deter people really? Like, are they effective practically? Are we actually deterring most people from doing anything by punishing them in certain kind of ways? There may be other ways to deter, and we're just not using it. But at the moment, that study, that's a big problem for someone who wants to argue that punishment is justified insofar as it deters, because the reality is, if it doesn't deter very many, well, then that means that whole prison systems may not be morally justified. that the very criminal justice system itself may at this point not be morally good enough to exist. But only if someone's trying to justify the system solely based off of deterrence, which is not how we do it. We tend to morally justify having prisons and jail systems and Department of Corrections and law enforcement officials. We tend to justify that not just because that deters people. We have all these other, restorative purposes, retributivism purposes, denunciation purposes. We have all of that in play too that we use to justify. But just a straight up deterrence argument, if someone wanted to say that punishment is morally okay because it deters, they're going to be into that's a real weak argument, because this is not a unique study. That's just one that I found. That's just like a quick internet search. But you could find hundreds of studies that would show that deterrence doesn't seem to be what happens when people are released. They may commit other crimes or whatever for various reasons, but regardless of the reasons, if being punished didn't stop people from going and doing the same thing again, well, then there was no deterrence that happened. It's just something to think about. Also, the objections to restitution or restorative theories of punishment. One of the concerns about restitution and restorative say that it's okay to punish insofar as it rights a previous wrong. There's a potential for this theory to make it seem like it's okay to do most anything as long as you're willing to pay the person back for it, which seems a little weird. That's typically how the objections to restitution and restorative go, is that if the only time that punishment is morally justified is when it is done in an effort to right a previous wrong, or it's to rewriting the scale, the balance of justice scale, we're making people pay the victims back, based on what they did. Well, what if someone is like a multi-billionaire and they can afford to pay most anything? And they're willing to pay it. Well, does that mean that they didn't do anything wrong at all by doing something bad as long as they're willing to pay for it? Some people don't like that. It's like, it seems to imply that as long as you can pay for whatever it is, then you've done nothing wrong. Nothing is really inherently wrong with, for example, rape, stealing, kidnapping, as long as you're willing to pay for it. And then punishment is okay as long as it's making you pay for it. But does that seem right? Quite a few people would think there's something a little shady about that. Y'all can read through this. Objections to rehabilitation. This one's always funny. That you'll typically hear this is like, well, doesn't this just sound all nice and cuddly? Like, we're going to make those bad people better. That's that's the sort of, condescending way that some people object to rehabilitation programs. Now, whether right or wrong, I'm not, passing judgment on this objection so much as a lot of people will be like, why care about whether the bad guys become better? We're there to punish. We're to make them to get back what's owed to us, or to make sure the victims get what's owed to them. We're not here to make the offender a better person, are we? But that's exactly what rehabilitation says, is that punishment is only morally justified insofar as we're using it to help the person who did the crime become a better person, to acquire better habits, more socially acceptable habits. And so in practice, rehabilitation can seem kind of weird. So say that the only way I'm morally justified in punishing, say, Bob for killing someone is the only way it's morally justified to punish Bob is if the punishment involves trying to help Bob become better habits that don't involve killing people. And I can achieve that by giving Bob a teddy bear and putting him in a nice room, with a heated pool and stuff for 10 years. Well, did I really punish Bob at all? But Bob comes out and he doesn't want to kill people anymore. Some people have a problem with that notion that punishment can be justified for other things than just trying to rehabit someone. And if we just focus solely on rehabiting people, then sometimes the best way to help people acquire new habits is to make it a really enjoyable experience all around. It may not have any unpleasantness at all. And then some people are like, yeah, but if someone kills someone, they need to suffer in some kind of way. And yet there's nothing that says that rehabilitation has to make someone suffer. It's normally not easy to acquire new habits. That takes work, dedication, perseverance, diligence, all of these kind of, states of mind and behavior. But none of that has to be especially painful. But then some people would say that certain crimes people need to be made to feel pain for them. Just think about, rape, home invasion, some of these really vicious crimes. Well, people are like, yeah, just taking the home invader that kicked in my door and beat up my family and maybe killed one of my kids. Yeah, I don't want them at like a private resort for 15 years, do we? Even if being at that private resort for 15 years would make them so they'd see the error of their ways, they would never want to do those things again, and they become a better overall person, a good contributing member of the community. But is that what we really want? Just think about it. I don't know. It's an objection to rehabilitation. It's worth thinking about. It's interesting either way. Objections to social values. Some people would object to say, yeah, punishment can't be justified based off of its ability to emphasize social values because we live in a society where values are so disparate and diverse that it's like punishing people to emphasize one set of social values might not be helpful to other people in the community that don't share those same values? Or are we sure that such things even exist, or are those just made up things? That's kind of the way it normally goes. I'm not saying that this upends the idea of punishment's justified insofar as it, supports and strengthens social values, but the objection to it typically involves there's so many different values in most any different community in, say, the United States that trying to justify we punished Bob for whatever Bob did because it strengthens our larger social values. That to some people's ears sounds a little weird, but everyone can think about it. Okay, objections to victim. Retributivism is mostly objections about this notion of thinking in terms of entitlements and earnings. That doesn't make sense to say that when a person hurts someone else, the victim, does it make any sense to say that the victim is entitled to something after that happens, or that they have earned something from the offender? That the offender owes them something, like that bag of potato chips. I can't walk out of the store because I owe the store the money for them until then I have to pay them. Does that notion of earnings and entitlements really make sense in the context of punishing people for crimes? That is, and can you pay people back really? For everything that might be, even say that somebody is owed something after there was a crime committed to them, but is it always possible to even get those earnings back? What they've earned, what they're owed? It's in practice it can be a little iffy. But just that whole notions of earnings and entitlements, just think about that carefully. If someone came into your house and stole your sofa, does that person owe you something? I mean, maybe they owe you the value of your sofa, or they owe you the value of, assume they didn't break your door or anything getting in. They just picked the lock, didn't hurt the lock or the door. Do they owe you something? Or did they just do something that's not acceptable and they need to be punished for it? But it's not that they need to be punished because they owe you specifically anything as the victim. They need to be punished for, say, in order to denounce their behavior. It would be nice if they gave us our sofa back, or they paid us, or were forced to pay us the value of the sofa. But we could do that through restoration or restitution. We don't have to think in terms of, yeah, that person owes me something. Do we? I don't know. It's very much worth always thinking about this notion of entitlement. What is owed to someone else? What someone else deserves. It's a tricky concept, or it can be. So unless a victim retributivist theorist can really explain out that, it's not good enough to just say that, yeah, somebody did something wrong to me, so I'm owed something back. Well, why? See, a theorist that wants to justify punishment based on this notion of what's owed to people can't just say, yeah, they're owed something because this person committed a crime against them. They need to explain why that owing relationship exists, how it works exactly. Anytime someone thinks they're entitled to something, it always makes sense to ask, well, why do you think that? Why? What evidence do you have that something is owed to you? I mean, it makes perfect sense in a business context where we write up a contract and and say you've got Bill and you got Ted, and Ted, contracts Bill to pour a concrete driveway at his house, and they sign a contract that says, yeah, this will be done in a certain amount of time. This is the price it's going to be, and a payment is expected upon delivery once it's poured, once it's dried, once it hasn't cracked after a certain period of time. If it's a concrete slab, then a certain amount of money is owed, and if there's a disagreement about it, here's the way we're going to work that out, etc., etc. And they have this contract, and then Bill and Ted, they sign the contract. Well, then, if Bill fails on his end, or Ted fails on his end to live up to the terms and conditions of the contract, well, then one of the two will be entitled to something. That's what entitlement tends to mean in a contract scenario. That two or more people agree to do various things, and then that means that that each of those people is entitled to whatever the other has promised them. There's normally a promising component associated with entitlements. You don't get entitlements for free. There's normally got to be a contract or a promise. Well, what kind of contract and promise is involved in crime committed against people? Is there? Did anybody promise not to hurt other people, and then they hurt them anyways? Well, if that's the case, if there is a contract, some people would talk in terms of what's known as a social contract, like just being a member of a particular community or society obligates you to obey the laws of that place. And then that's how this is approached. That's how we get to earnings and entitlement talk in terms of crime. But it's got to be assumed that there's some sort of social contract in play. And some people may or may not buy into that notion. And everyone in this class can think about it. Does the fact that we are choosing to live, say, in a particular state, like South Carolina, at any given moment, does that mean that we are contracting ourselves to the state of South Carolina, that we are agreeing and promising to obey the laws of South Carolina? Are we, by our very staying and remaining in the state of South Carolina, is that our consent to say, yes, I agree to obey these laws, and if I break them, then the state is entitled to punishment? that the state is entitled to collect whatever I, broke or did wrong, on behalf of the victims or the state itself or whatever. Typically, none of us have signed a physical piece of paper to that effect. I mean, we know what terms and conditions look like anytime you open an email account or most any kind of, you become a member of, some association. But just think of starting up an email account or any kind of buying account like with Amazon or any online vendor. There'll be a screen that pops up, terms and conditions. Anytime if we get a credit card, there'll be that big long list of terms and conditions. Well, that obligates us. But did we ever sign anything? Did we check the I acknowledge or I agree to these terms and conditions box when we continue to remain in the state of South Carolina? Is that equivalent to checking that I agree box? If you don't think it is, then this whole notion of retributivism with earnings and entitlements is going to sound a little iffy, or at least should. If a person doesn't buy into these notions of tacitly consenting to the rules of a community just because you entered that community and stayed there and you incurred the benefits and privileges of being there. For example, someone like Socrates, for those who may be really interested in this notion of a social contract, they can check out, it was written by Plato, and it's about Socrates, and the work is called the Crito. It's a dialogue, and in that dialogue, Socrates provides a really interesting argument about being obligated, what we owe the state and the legal system, because of this, based solely on the sheer fact that we stay. That we could leave a state, but we choose to stay. We choose to stay. We choose to pay taxes. We choose to drive on the highways. We choose to enjoy the safety and security of being in that community provides us with. The resources that are close to us, all the grocery stores, the easy access to libraries, easy access to hospitals, all of those are benefits that we're receiving for having stayed in a community. That if we were not in that community, we would not be able to partake in all those benefits. And so we choose to stay. Well, someone like Socrates would argue that you're choosing to stay means that you're also choosing to obey the rules and the laws of that area. And if you know that there's flaws in the system, like that sometimes people are charged with crimes that they don't actually commit, sometimes they're convicted of crimes that they don't actually commit. And I think all of us would be aware that this does happen sometimes, and yet we choose to stay in a community. Well, that has consequences. That what if we are charged with a crime that we didn't commit, we're convicted, would it be okay for us to escape, try to run away? Socrates is going to say no. Because we knew that could happen, we've chose to stay in this community and reap all these benefits. Therefore, we're obligated to obey the sentencing. We agreed to obey sentencing because we knew it could go sideways for us. But we just were like, oh, well, it's very unlikely that'll be me. But we knew that it could be me. And that means we have tacitly consented to obey the laws even when mistakes are made by the legal system itself. It's extremely interesting. It's called the Crito, Plato, the Crito. You should check it out if you're interested in this notion of socially contracting and how that can create earnings and entitlements. It's a really neat little article or dialogue. It was written 2,500 years ago, but it captures all of this stuff that I've been talking about really well. The objections to community retributivism, owing some larger community. Couldn't someone say that they don't owe anything to anyone but themselves? Like, think back to the subjectivist position that we looked at early in the semester, where someone could say, I'm the only one that's qualified to judge my own actions. I answer to me, myself, and I alone. And well, then at that point, if the only one that a person answers to is themselves, well, then how could they ever owe like a larger community anything? So does community retributivism, just like victim retributivism, this could be said about the same as and this has to do with that notion of a social contract that a true blue subjectivist, a hardcore subjectivist, would always deny that they entered into a social contract. The inherent nature of like hardcore subjectivism is that a person doesn't think they owe anybody anything ever, unless they happen to want to owe them something. You know, maybe a little selfish, maybe, but still, or a little self-absorbed. We might say that. But either way, whether it is or it isn't, I'm not judging that. There are some groups of people that might not want to buy into this notion of owing communities things. It's just something to think about. And if we don't, and if we cannot owe communities anything, well, then punishment would not be justified based on some reason that it's okay to punish because it gets the community what's owed to them. But if a person doesn't buy in that people can owe communities anything, well, then that would make punishment not morally okay in those scenarios. That would be contrary to community retributivist theorists. And then offender retributivism, that we owe the offender something. And we're immoral if we don't give it what we owe to them. This can have some really kind of rough consequences where suppose that we determine that what the offender, a person who rapes someone, suppose we determine what we owe them is to be raped back. Well, who's got to do that? And we're immoral now, remember, on this offender retributivism. If we do not give someone back what they have earned, then we're the ones that are wrong. Sure, they're bad for doing whatever they did, but we're just as bad if we don't pay them back. That this morally obligates us to pay, say, the rapist back. Someone rapes someone, and now that means we as a community might owe them a rape back. And if we don't rape them back, we're the immoral ones. It's on us. That sounds a little weird to some people. That notion right there. Really? So it's just an objection, it's a potential concern that people have about offender retributivism. But look through it, think about it. It's really interesting. Denunciation, that just sounds a little weird. That's the way the objection goes against it. That does it justify punishment as far as the punishment tells someone you did bad? We don't like that. Is that enough to say the punishment was justified? It was okay to incarcerate a person solely because that serves as a way of letting them know we don't like what you did. Is that good enough to justify incarcerating someone? Maybe, but maybe not. And to what extent? Say, is it good enough? Say that somebody does something bad, and I yell at them really, really loudly. Like, say, Bob kills somebody. I always pick on Bob and Sally and whoever, but by that name, it's just easy to refer to. But say Bob kills somebody, and I say, okay, well, I'm going to punish Bob, and I'm going to punish Bob by yelling at him really, really loudly. And as long as Bob gets the message that, I didn't approve of that action, then Bob's punished, all is well. Is that good enough to say that the punishment was justified? Maybe. It's just something to think about. And then the objection to hybrids, they're going to be just a conglomeration of all the objections to these various ones that we've looked at. Hopefully, everyone at this point can see that everyone needs to carefully read through this handout. I've just talked over the top of it to give everybody a feel for what's at stake in these debates. But just know, none of these objections upend any of these theories. Hopefully, while I was talking through that, people are able to say, well, I don't know if that really upends that theory. Hopefully. They've seen that, but also everyone's gotten the impression that these theories of punishment, what justifies punishment, is not 100% certain. None of them seem absolutely definitive. Not at this point. Maybe we'll figure it out later. But we're humans. We're still working on this stuff. But hopefully these objections and going through these theories has given everybody just a sense of what's at stake in debates about punishment. When people are talking about reforming a prison system, why do they want to reform it? What are they after? Might their agenda be a sort of victim retributivist understanding of punishment? What are they more in line with? Do they want to? Here's a way to think about it. How can you apply this to an everyday, like little community social policy issue? Is say that someone wants to take more tax dollars. One group of politicians want to give local prison systems more tax dollars. That they need the money to hire new staff or more staff. Well, the idea is, do we really want to give that money to the system? Well, how are we going to figure that out? We would need to maybe look at, well, what is the goals of the system? Can it be achieved with the current numbers of staff, or is more staff actually needed to achieve those goals? Well, what are those goals? Are those goals justifiable? Are they working? Like, is this system deterring people from doing bad things? Or is it ensuring that victims are getting what they were owed? Or might, instead of just hiring more staff, maybe that money needs to go into a redesign of administration or whatever. You see, it's like, and depending on how someone conceptualizes the purpose of punishment and what justifies punishment, that can make a huge difference on whether or not it makes sense to allocate state money in certain ways toward various prison or law enforcement. For example, like, what is the purpose of, like, the law enforcers typically, are there to capture those who break laws. Well, that's good. But what about when it comes to sentencing people for crimes? Like, should our sentence reflect like that we're trying to get people back what's owed to them, or should the sentence reflect really loudly that we really want to deter other people from doing this, etc.? That's how this relates to real world stuff. Is that these theories underlie our whole legal system. But now we get into that something that is extremely practically relevant. Regardless of what a person thinks of punishment theories and the objections to them, this is relevant. Anytime we punish someone, the sort of default assumption is we would like the punishment to fit the crime. Everybody in here will have heard that notion, that it's important that punishments fit crimes, right? We don't want punishments that don't fit crimes. For example, someone steals a train, $1 million, train engine. They steal it. Well, as punishment, we don't want to just say, okay, you can keep the train, you can sell it, do whatever you want, as long as you walk over here and we hit you in the face with a fly swatter. So that's your punishment. We smack you with the fly swatter and say, bam. That doesn't seem like a punishment that fits the crime, does it? When the person steals this big high dollar item, we allow them to take it and keep it and sell it, as long as we just get to smack them with a fly swatter and say, bad, don't do that again. That seems like a punishment that's far, far, far weaker than the extent of the crime. Maybe, maybe not. Or think about it like this. If someone goes into a store and they steal like $2 worth of stuff, and then we throw them in prison for 25 years with no chance of parole. That seems a little unfitting to the crime, doesn't it? It's like the extreme ways really normally help us see that, yeah, it's possible for crimes and punishments not to fit well together at all. But when does a punishment go too far? Or when does it not go far enough? That's the question of proportionality and fitness. How do we work that out? This is not easy. This is the actual Achilles heel to all attempts to justify punishment, from a moral angle at least, and a practical angle. This is a practical problem that makes the morality extremely difficult to deal with in a lot of cases. For example, say that, here we're going to have who? Bill and Jill this time. So say that Jill has a picture of her long dead but so well beloved grandmother. It's a one-of-a-kind picture, and it's on actual photograph paper. It's not digital. It hasn't been scanned in. This is the one and only one. It's a one-of-a-kind. Bill breaks in, grabs up that picture, and burns it up, destroys it. Well, what punishment fits Bill's crime? Jill could be absolutely distraught and devastated. This is the one-of-a-kind. I mean, this is irreplaceable. What punishment fits Bill's crime? Do we lock Bill up for 10 years? Do we put Bill on probation for 50 years and make him pay a $50 to $75 a month probation fee for 50 years and pay Jill $500,000 in damages? Does that seem to fit? It was just a picture, right? But yet there's a lot of trauma here. There's a whole lot of trauma, and it was a crime. Bill did something that is against the law. He destroyed something that another person owned. There is a crime. But what punishment's fitting for that? I mean, is it fitting if Bill were to have a one-of-a-kind picture? If we were going to do a strict eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth approach to this, what we would do is say, well, Bill has this one-of-a-kind picture of his, deceased but well-beloved grandmother, and he cares about it just as much as Jill cared about hers, and so he destroyed and burned Jill's picture, so then Jill should be able to go in there and get his picture and burn it up. If that existed, then we could actually have perfect proportionality. We could have perfect fitness, where that is the one upside, the major upside of eye for eye, tooth for tooth, if we can do exact likes for likes. But getting exact likes for likes is often not possible, because what are the odds that Bill's going to do that to Jill's picture and that Bill's got an exact same scenario on his side? Probably not. Or think about it like this. Perfect proportionality is Bill kills one of Jill's children, and then Jill goes and kills one of Bill's children. That is proportional only to the effect that, or like for likes, only to the effect that Bill cared just as much about his kid as Jill cared about hers. And if Bill's kid is of the exact same age, of the exact same everything pretty much as Jill's. Otherwise, it won't be proportional. It won't be perfectly fitting. A like for like scenario. And in the everyday real world, we typically rarely are able to get likes for likes, perfect proportionality. So the challenge is, how do we still maintain some sort of fitness so that punishments fit crimes when it's not possible to make them perfectly fit most times? Here's an example. Just think about, does this fit the crime? Someone shows up, they steal your car. The police catch them about an hour later. Your car gets returned. That person is arrested for stealing your car. They're grand theft auto or some version of lesser crime. Something that's car theft, either way. What punishment fits that crime? Say that you didn't even know they took it. This makes it really clear about how difficult proportionality and fitness questions can be. Say that someone steals your car, you didn't even know it was stolen, but an hour later the police knock on your door and say, "Oh yeah, someone stole your car, but we got it back. It's right here." And you look, and it's basically in exactly the same place it was wherever you left it. You look at your car, it's down, like maybe a fraction of a percent of gas is out of the car now. But the person didn't tear up anything in the car. Nothing is harmed at all in the car. Nothing. You were not inconvenienced. Nothing really happened. And yet, you want to press charges for the person who stole your car. But the idea is, what punishment fits that crime? The only like for likes would be if you went and took that person's car and returned it within an hour and that person never knew it, and you didn't drive it any more than the person that stole your car drove your car, and things like that. I mean, sure, your safety and security, sense of safety and security, there's a psychological component to all this that might have been hurt or traumatized in this process, but as long as you could create that same level of psychological disconcerting state of being in the mind of the person who stole the car, then wouldn't that be perfectly proportional? Wouldn't that be fitting? And notice, no one's gone to jail. No one's paid a fine in that scenario. And yet, typically what will happen is if someone steals a car, even if it's returned within an hour, and the owner never even knew until the police told them it was stolen, the owner was not inconvenienced, that person could still easily receive over a year or more of probation. They'll have court fees. They could easily encounter anywhere from $3,000 to $10,000 to $15,000 in fines. That person could easily be sentenced to jail for a certain period of time. That person could easily receive a felony for that. In many states, I mean most states in the United States. Does that seem fitting for the crime? It seems it's not proportional, that's for sure. But is it morally okay to punish people in ways that are way outside of what the actual deed they did was about? I don't know. Think about it. Another example is to say that a neighbor that doesn't like you runs over your dog. What's a fitting punishment for your neighbor? Say that you call the police, say, yep, your neighbor's ran over your dog. And this is your long lost dog. I mean, or your beloved dog. I mean, this was part of your family. And this person laughs in your face about it. They're like, yeah, I don't like you. I'll just kill your dog. Well, you may be able to sue that person and get some financial compensation for it. And that person may be arrested for some form of cruelty to animals. But your dog is still gone. And that person has no remorse for having done that. And yet they may get a year or so probation. They have to pay you back. Maybe you sue them and you get, $50,000, $60,000 in pain and suffering. But does that seem to fit what they did? I mean, they did something that was really almost evil to you. And yet, yeah, you get some money back. And yeah, but they don't seem to care. They were willing to pay whatever it was. Does it seem like the punishment fit the crime? Your dog, it's not like, I guess though more fitting would be if they had a beloved dog and you went and killed their dog. That would be eye for eye, tooth for tooth, like for likes. They'd kill your dog, you kill their dog. And they experience the same degree of pain, suffering, trauma that they caused to you. That would be like for like. But notice there's no incarceration there. There's no fine there. There's no jail time there. That's the thing that many people kind of get. A lot of people are confused about the notion of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That what it really is supposed to mean, this lex talionis is what it's in Latin referred to sometimes. What it means is likes for likes. Someone does X to you, they get X done back to them. And in this scenario, it would be they kill your dog, you kill their dog. It has nothing to do with the way our current legal system operates. So these are good examples to show that our current legal system does not operate on eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. For better or for worse, it doesn't. That instead, our current legal system in the United States, at least, operates off of we financially punish, we curtail people's freedoms, we'll incarcerate them, lock them up, or chew up their time, making them do community service, these various things. But we typically do not do likes for likes. And then say, but likes for likes tends to be the most proportional way to do it. Like for like, one is most proportionate to what? Well, another one. Or a 5 is most proportionate to, well, 5. Those are the same. That's perfect. Whereas most everything in intervention we do as a society with our legal system is never really proportionate to the crime. It's like, say that someone goes into a football stadium and or they go to their neighbor's house and they spray paint some offensive message on the front of their neighbor's house. Well, proportional, if that's what we were doing, strictly fitting eye for eye, then we would allow the neighbor to paint the same offensive thing on the other neighbor's house. But we would have to recreate the same level of psychological turmoil that was experienced by the first victim in the head of the one who did the original painting, but that doesn't have anything to do with arresting anybody. Just think about that. It's interesting, a lot of times people will talk about they're fans of eye for eye, and yet the majority of people in at least this country, we don't operate like that. Like our legal system doesn't operate like that. So that is interesting because we can ask that next question. We can say, well, are punishments morally justified when they don't fit crimes? Like, is punishment ever justified when it doesn't perfectly fit a crime? If it's not like for like, then is it morally justified? Or say that it doesn't have to be perfect like for likes. Say that Bill kills somebody's child and Bill has no children of his own, so it's not possible for us to say, yeah, the victim whose child was killed can go over and kill one of Bill's kids. Bill doesn't have any kids. So we can't do a like for like in that scenario, an eye for an eye. So what do we do? How do we justify whatever punishment we do for Bill? If we kill Bill, say capital punishment Bill for killing someone else's child, that's not like for like because the child was of a certain age and Bill is of a different age. And so it's not going to be a like for like, but we still sometimes people want to say that, yeah, that punishment fit the crime, but it didn't fit it perfectly. So how do we justify these imperfect fits between punishment and the actual deeds that were done? Like someone steals over $2,000 worth of merchandise and they're locked up for 6 months to a year in jail. They have these huge fines that far exceed $2,000. Legal fees, court costs. Anybody that knows any lawyers or anybody in the justice systems can just ask, like, how much do court fees typically run? Yeah, more than $2,000. So it's like just the court fees alone could be more money that person's required to pay than the value of what they stole. So how do we justify that morally? It's an interesting question. Proportionality is the most morally relevant question of all when it comes to punishments. And there's many cases here that that I talked through. Definitely carefully read these things. And then there's this last notion of what's known as collateral consequences. These are consequences that the justice system knows exist that follow from being subjected to certain punishments, but that are not officially recognized. The sort of epitome of this is like a person that receives a felony conviction. That say someone steals over $2,000 worth of items. In many states, if you damage or destroy or steal something over $2,000, you can be convicted of a felony. You can get that label attached to your name for the rest of your life. And the idea is with that label comes certain limitations for the rest of a person's life. Like they may not be able to get certain business licenses or certifications. They may never be able to teach at, elementary schools. They may never be able to work at daycares. They may never be able to do any of that. And their original crime is, say, they just destroyed $2,000 worth of somebody's property, or they stole it, or whatever. And now they could never be a licensed engineer, for example, or a lawyer. They'd never be accepted by the state bar because they have a felony conviction. I mean, now this varies across states. This sort of stuff does, but in some states that is a consequence of having that label. Well, the idea though is it morally fair or okay to have someone that's still receiving consequences for a crime that really didn't have anything to do with it? Like, say someone destroys $2,000 worth of property. Well, if they're convicted of a felony, they can no longer vote. They can no longer have firearms like guns and stuff. Well, what does voting and guns have to do with destroying $2,000 worth of property? What's the connection? So that's what's known as collateral consequences. And there's a question about that. Are those morally okay? Is it okay to subject people to a punishment that has consequences that hang around the rest of their days for certain crimes? Does it make sense? Is it morally fair? It's not good enough to say, well, someone knows going in that those things can happen. That may not be good enough to say that, because there's still that question of proportionality that hangs over there. Just because people may know that there's long-range consequences to certain actions, that doesn't say anything about whether the actual punishment itself is fitting to the crime. It doesn't matter that we know that it's disproportional or unfitting. It has to actually have some justification for that lack of fitting. Morally, it does anyway. Or this is what many ethical and punishment theorists would say, is that it's not enough to just say that, oh yeah, people know, so that's what makes it okay. It's like that would be equivalent to saying, yeah, that say we have a social disparity where one group of people is heavily abused by another group of people, and well, everybody knows that it's that way. Does that make the abuse itself or the bad treatment justified? Most people would say no. Just because we know that something can happen or does happen doesn't make that something morally okay. You see that, and so that same way of thinking can be applied to collateral consequences, and say just because a person may know that doing certain crimes results in lifelong sanctions, that doesn't mean that those lifelong sanctions are morally justified, especially if they're far out of proportion to the actual crime they committed. There has to be some reasoning and argumentation done to justify applying a disproportionate punishment to crimes. That's necessary to defend that as far as ethicists go. I'm not saying that's just right or wrong about this. I'm just saying the majority would say that, yeah, we need to have some reasons to support claims to the effect that although this punishment is way out of proportion to what the actual crime was, it's nowhere near likes for likes. We were still morally justified in doing it. And then that's when we can go back up to some of those punishment theories and maybe get some help there. But it is a huge practical reality about punishment systems that it's good for all of us to be aware of. That being said, everyone should read through this. There's examples of this, a lot of them in here. And some of these theories seem especially prone to like disproportionate punishments. They seem like they almost would encourage it. Like think about a deterrence theory. That deterrence says punishment is justified insofar as it deters people from doing the various crimes. Well, what if in order to achieve true deterrence, we had to be far disproportionate? So say that we want people to never steal. So what do? If a person is caught and convicted of stealing, we kill them and their whole family. Well, that would be far disproportionate to the stealing. They stole something and we kill all them and all theirs. That would be very far out of proportion to what they did. But a deterrence theorist would seem, well, that punishment could be justified, could be morally okay. That's why some people are a little suspicious about deterrence and harm reduction. And remember, with any sort of deterrence and harm reduction are kind of consequentialist framework, and with consequentialism, nothing is off the table. If the majority's made better off by it, then the few could be made to suffer very tremendously. And so that's a concern that a lot of people have about consequential style theories in general, and it applies to deterrence and harm reduction and other punishment theories based off of this notion of proportionality. That if we think that it's morally suspicious to punish people far disproportionately to their crime, and then a sort of consequentialist based theory of punishment allows such to happen and says it would be morally justified, then we may not want to buy into harm reduction or deterrence, because by their very nature, those two theories could, say, yeah, it's totally fine for these widely disproportionate things to happen for the reasons of deterrence and harm reduction. It's just something to think about. That's what the purpose of this whole video is to give everybody things to think about in terms of punishment, because punishment is a real thing. It's a real set of actions that people are engaged in all day, every day, throughout our legal system, throughout our court systems, in our houses with our children. Our jobs have punishments for misdeeds, various things. And so punishment's a real in everybody's world phenomenon. And so thinking in terms of proportionality, collateral consequences, and these theories of punishment is extremely useful. It gives us a lot more to think about and talk about. We will talk about much of this in this week's discussion. But I hope this video has been helpful. We have surveyed some of the criteria for what makes an action punishment. We've surveyed quite a few of the theories of what morally justifies punishment. We've also looked at many of the objections, or some of the knee-jerk reaction objections that might be raised against such theories. And we've also talked about proportionality and collateral consequences, and how those really are extremely morally important when we're thinking about punishing people. They can make a huge difference in whether someone would want to say that punishment is moral or immoral in certain cases. The extent to which we punish. Do we go too far? Do we not go far enough? Those kind of questions really matter when we're assessing the morality of specific punishments. Or ethicists tend to think they do at the very least. But I hope this video has been helpful, and I really look forward to what people think with this discussion. And so until then, definitely let me know if there's any questions about this. And this week's readings, the textbook readings, kind of focus on the social values theory of punishment. That's where like right here, so everyone knows, the readings for this week are heavily focused on social values. They are focused too on capital punishment, but remember, as this video is emphasized over and over, executing people for hugely vicious crimes, that's just one form of punishment amongst many. It just happens to be the articles that are in our textbook. But don't think of punishment as just capital punishment. There are the majority of punishment is not capital punishment. But the two authors, one of them really thinks that something like capital punishment's great because it strengthens and emphasizes certain social values like human dignity, the sanctity of life, those things. The other author disagrees and says we could strengthen those values and we would be better off not to do capital punishment because it would strengthen those values even more than by doing it. And so everyone will read those articles this week and can think about that possibility and the reasoning the authors provide. But until then, we'll talk a little later.